Hello, and welcome to another week of the Storied Arcs podcast. I'm your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And today we are concluding Death Month, which I have gotten feedback on. Objectively, people think wild choice for a January theme month, but
it is a little. It's
on the nose.
Too on the nose.
Yeah,
but you know.
But anyway, I'm like this is the one that we started with and worked backwards from here to create Death Month. It's like we're both very excited for Daytripper.
Yeah.
And I've listened.
This is a book that's been, when we talk about the show, and Mike and I offline often talk about, we're always throwing books and titles back and forth, and this is one that came up very, very early, like maybe in the initial pitch of like, I would love to do this book sometime, but how do we do it? Do we break it up in half? Is it, we tossed this book around a lot, and it wasn't until we kind of settled on this theme, this overall arching idea of death, that it seemed to really fit in. But this is a book that you and I have discussed offline and said bandied about for literally years. So it's exciting to get to jump into it now.
Yeah. And I think we'll get to things like, how we came to this, our personal interaction with it as we go. But the first thing we have to talk about is the deluxe edition, which the deluxe edition is not a new thing. Like, I'm holding my copy of the deluxe edition, and this is Vertigo before Vertigo went under and came back. Like, that's how old the deluxe edition is, or can be.
I want to say the original trade was 2011. The series ended in 2010. And so it probably comes out, let's see. Yeah, so the
mid to late
initial,
2011.
The issues ran from December 2009 to September 2010. So you're probably looking at maybe at the very end of 2011 or 2010, or probably the beginning of 2011, because it did win the 2011 Eisner for Best Limited Series of Story Arc. So it probably comes out, I want to say, beginning of 2011, let's say, for the regular trade. That deluxe trade was probably like 2015 maybe, and then there was an absolute edition, which I think is currently out of print now, but that absolute edition just came out in 2020. It had been rumored for a long time, which was
probably a black label at that point, and now it's going to go back to Vertigo for the next printing.
Yes, it probably was black label, and I hope, God, I hope that anything that was Vertigo that was switched over to black label, now that Vertigo is back, if they were to reprint things, and again, I believe that Absolute Edition is out of print, because I think they only had that initial printing, that definitely would have been black label. And now that Vertigo is alive again, I mean, this is kind of the very essence of what a Vertigo book should be, and what a Vertigo book is, and what 100%. It represented.
As I was reading this again, I was like, I kind of had the thought, why do I read anything other than Vertigo? There's so much old Vertigo that I've never read. Also, this one, which it has like the old like newspaper type paper in it.
It's a little thinner. Yeah,
feels like it feels like reading older comics to someone who, if you've only started reading in the 2010s, 2020s, this type of paper material feels like reading at 80s or 90s or copper or Bronze Age comic. But it's an intentional choice here, because what I have is the 9th printing of the deluxe edition. And again, all of this before Vertigo went under and they did a black label printing. And, so it's just like this book just blew up. And here's the wild thing. I also own it, 2 full runs of it in single issue, all of which were purchased for $1 an issue. Like, after all these prints, it's not like a speculator book. It's just people who know comics love this book.
This is a book that I think I may have mentioned it back in the Zero a few weeks back, but this is probably the comic I have recommended the most to people who say they don't read comics but are interested in the idea of comics. Because most people, when they say when they know you're a comic person and they're like, I don't really read comics, what they mean is, I don't read superheroes. And that's a totally fair a kind of assumption on their part when they talk about comics, that comics equal superheroes. So when they say that and say, well, I haven't read comics, what should I read? In my mind, that immediately triggers, okay, don't tell them read Spider-Man. Unless they specifically say, hey, I want to read Spider-Man, I want to read Batman. That's a different story. If they just say, I want to get into comics, but I haven't read comics, I never say, well, you should definitely pick up even like the most intro superhero stuff. Because if they're not into superheroes, they're not into it. It's not going to happen. least not in this, not in this capacity. Daytripper has always been that book, and since I read it, it's been that book that I say, try something like this. If you can get around the realism and kind of the kind of the magical realism that this book happens, they kind of exist in. And what I think is really interesting about it is that when, before you even get into the story, you have this beautiful introduction by Craig Thompson. And again, if you don't know
And let me
Craig Thompson,
say, Craig Thompson was the guy for me
yeah,
who was the first time I had that moment of, oh crap, I didn't know comics could do that.
exactly. Yeah.
I got blankets in 2014 or something, and had been reading like not exclusively superhero, but like IP stuff. It was like James Bond and stuff like that, comics. And when I got this, I was like, oh my God, this is what I want. Like, this is like, I love my superheroes, but blankets is what I want. And so I've been chasing that high ever since the day that I got Craig Thompson.
And so many of the books that we cover, that we like to talk about, and we like to hopefully try and shine a light on with this show, are creator-owned indie books. Some of them are superhero. They obviously can be superhero stuff. Superhero isn't a realm solely owned by Marvel and DC. But so much stuff that we try to focus on is that creator-owned independent stuff. And what I love in this intro that Craig Thompson does here, he talks about it head on. That's the idea of the comics is divided into these two worlds, kind of the fantastical and the realism. Fantasy is that superhero escapism. It's the cape and cowl. It's Spider-Man, Superman, Batman, the Avengers, Justice League, all that stuff there. That's the escapism. It's the power fantasy that comes with all those books that can still be, they can be representative, they can be metaphors for real life or whatnot. And then you have this other set of comics, the stuff that like someone like Craig Thompson has done, Blankets, which is like real slice of life, kind of that auto-bio stuff, or this idea of infusing your book with more of a sense of realism. And obviously what he talks about, what comes with realism, is this sense of cynicism that comes with real life, that often is associated with real life. Right. Superhero is the optimist, the fact that there is some beings out there, powerful beings that can fix the rights of
in broad archetypes. Yes. Yeah. Although superhero stuff has realized, like, I think goes through, fits and starts where it goes
through cycles.
It's like, oh,
absolutely
we got to get more gritty. We got to get more real world. It's like, that's not why people came to this. But there are people who've been reading it for 30 years who love, the really dark turn for a superhero story, but it will always bounce back.
That's what I was going to say. It'll always cycle, it'll be more gritty and dark. And then you'll get something where there's some initiative from Marvel and DC where, like, we got to get back to basics, meaning we got to get back to the optimism, meaning that's stasis. That's what it should be. That the gritty darkness, the hardcore, that's the outlier. They'll always say, we got to get back to basics. We got to get back to what it was. That's what Rebirth is, all in. Anything that these initiatives that these, Marvel now, it's all about getting back to their roots. It always comes back to that sense of optimism that you get from superheroes. And what Craig Thompson kind of, literally illustrates, because again, this intro is so beautiful that he wrote and drew this with Daytripper, is that Daytripper is this blend of the fantastical and the real. We're following the life of this one man, this one person. Yet it is infused with this crazy sense of, he dies at the end of each issue, but yet he doesn't, because we see, when you get to the end, you can track all the moments of his life and you see how they build together. But yet each issue ends as if he had died in this moment. And what that reflects on and what that means kind of in a larger meta sense. But again, we know he doesn't actually die. It's a very kind of heavy scare quotes there. But blending those things in there, and I think a lot of that comes from Moon and Ba's art. There is this surreality to the way that they draw kind of characters and environments that they're real life, they're places, these are people, but there's something just kind of maybe a little off about them. They're not going for photorealism, right. and there's something that it doesn't put you on edge per se, but it like it triggers something in the back of your mind that I'll refer to issue 9, which is the only one that doesn't have an age to it for our character Braz. It's just called Dreams, right?
Which is funny. It's my least favorite issue. But go on.
It is, but that is very much, I think, indicative of what their style is. There's a dreaminess to it where you are maybe a little uncertain, or
I mean, the front cover says it all, right?
yeah, what you
It's a
what
guy
you're-
on a bench,
yeah,
and bleeding out of his head are all these fantastical, surreal colors and scenes, and
yeah.
typewriters and coffee shops and cities and beaches. It's like it's like the most perfect front cover I could possibly imagine.
What are you seeing? What are you reading? Is this real? Is it actually happening? Does it really matter? But all that blends in with the style that Moon and Ba have, and it works. It works so perfectly in this book. And I think it's why it's something you can come back to, because you can find all those layers that you can find just the real like truth in the character and the relationships. You can get lost in the fantastical elements and the larger ideas of living and what it means to live and what you do with your life. There you can find all those layers in this book, and it's a reason why it's a book that I come back to. I was going to say reread once or twice a year. I can sometimes I don't even read it. Sometimes I just flip through it and luxuriate in the artwork that's on the page. So it's one that I return to often. Yeah.
So as discussed, I did a 1 issue a day reread plan between our last recording and this.
Nice.
And then this morning I did a quick binge read. And for the binge read, I did what you're describing with the art, and then I only read the narration boxes, no dialogue boxes.
Ah, interesting.
Which gave me an interesting vantage point, because I was like, what is the voice of the narrator here? This is like, the omniscient narrator. And, at the end when he's typing on the typewriter, I thought, oh, maybe this whole thing is his obit that he's written for himself. But the fact that the last issue has a different color in that narration box would suggest to me that is not what they're doing.
Yeah, I think at that point it suggests that he is reading. I mean, at the end, the narration box is his father's letter to him to Braz. So hence why it's different there. But I do like the idea that maybe you're reading it because again, every issue ends with someone writing Braz's obituary for having died that day.
Right.
And I guess the implication is that maybe it's Braz writing it himself, or what Braz would write as the obituary
about
writer.
himself, right?
About
after
this
reflecting
person.
at this moment of his life.
Yes. Yeah.
Here's my thing. Two thoughts on that. First, my thought as the more I return to this book. So after I read it once, I loved it. Didn't read it again for 3 or 4 or 5 years. So
when did you first read it? Just for some context.
I want to say whenever you recommended it to me. I think it was 2018. Okay. It was small talk at the comic shop.
Yeah.
It was I was holding
before the show though, before you and I were doing this.
Oh my gosh. Okay, years before that. Yeah, no, but I think that was what put you on my radar as I need more from this guy. Because I think I was holding it was a similar vibe. I was holding Royal City or something. And we were talking about this, and I think you said, "Have you ever read Daytripper?" And I was like, "Never heard of it." And I think you went and grabbed the Vertigo copy off the shelf, and I
probably did. It was
I looked at the cover and I was like, done. So the first time I read it, what stuck with me was what I now consider the gimmick. The gimmick is, he dies at the end of every issue, the big gasp, Twilight Zone twist thing. Yeah. Now I'm you could cut the last 2 issues off every page, and this would still be one of my favorite books of all time, because what I enjoy about it is not that twist, even though that adds, a really great lens and vantage point for discussion and really makes you think about each issue as its own piece. But what I love about it, and I don't know if anybody uses this for Western comics, but it's the slice of life nature of the story. That's a big term in manga. I don't hear comic readers talking about slice of life stories quite as much. If they do, it's usually a tell that they're a manga reader.
Well, it's less common in Western comics. The idea of just we're following people around. One of my favorite books of all time, one of my favorite comics is called Giant Days by John Allison.
Oh yeah.
And Max Aaron, Lisa Trimman. That is just, it follows the lives of 3 British college girls, you know? And it just, and yes, there are these wacky, weird adventures and that, but it just follows them through and what their life is like. That stuff is rarer in terms of Western comic. But yeah, you're right. Up until the quote unquote twist at the end of each issue, you're just following this guy for the most part, like one day. Some of the issues span like 6 months later or whatever it is. But yeah, you're just following this guy doing something at one very specific point in his life.
And he's not special, really. I
Yeah.
mean, like,
Yeah.
and I don't mean that in a derogatory, but he doesn't
Yes.
have superpowers. He's not the greatest writer ever. He's not like a master poet. He's, it's not Goodwill Hunting,
Yeah.
type slice of life. It is a slice of life.
Just
And
trying to
what
live
I
his life.
love
Yeah.
is, this is the beginning of the letter from Moon and Bot the back. And it's got their first drawings. This is the deluxe edition, so you don't get this, I don't think, in the single issues. But it says, these were the first drawings I made to try to explain, above all, that this would be a story about quiet moments. It would be about what you can tell from somebody's eyes, an exchange of looks, a smile. That idea of this book is what you can tell from somebody's eyes. Read that sentence, then go reread the book. And
Yeah.
it's one of those, like, I didn't process how good their facial artwork was until I read that sentence. And thankfully, I finished my 10-day single issue reread. Then I read this letter in the back. And then when I did my binge this morning, just looking at the art, which is a lot of faces, faces, scenery, and reading the narration boxes, it came to life in a new way. The exchange of looks, the smile, the things that, like, that's how memories actually form in your brain. Like, there are not, if I the further back I go in my memory, I cannot replay entire scenes, but there's like the catalytic moment in important moments of my life that are freeze framed, or like, it's almost like when you take the picture on your phone and it does like the here's the 10 moments around that, select the best one is the keeper. That's kind of how memory works. It's not like a recording or watching a 5-minute video of an important moment from my childhood. I remember an instant, a moment. And that's
Sure.
what this book captures. And so he gives you just enough in each story to lead up to really important moment. And that moment ends up making one of these days the most important days in Braz's life.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I think, one of the larger questions about about the overall theme of this book is that what constitutes the important moments of your life? I mean, are you aware of them when they happen? I think general consensus is like, no, you're not aware of them. It's only in hindsight, right? But
Right.
what makes, in terms of the construct of this story, what makes these moments the important ones? Is it because he, quote unquote, dies in each issue? Is that why, looking back, these are the moments? Or is it when you look at the whole tapestry of his life that these were the turning points? This is when he was at his lowest. This is when he was at his highest. This is when he had his heart broken. But is it only in retrospect, or does it have to have this capper at the end? The way the issues literally end. Does it have to have this oomph at the end to make it important? And I think what they're trying to say is because as we get to the end, issue 10 there, when he presumably dies, I wasn't saying natural causes, but obviously he's sick, but when he reaches and has a fulfilled life there, that these moments were the important ones, not because he died, but because you look back and say that these were the turning points. These were the kind of inflection points of your life, but you're not always aware of them. And it doesn't take dying to register that.
Here's my favorite part about it is none of these are the contrived moments of life. But what I mean by that is I had so many people tell me, mostly like mother-in-laws type people tell me that my wedding was going to be, it's like, it was the best day of my life. It's going to be the best day of your life. Braz's wedding is not in here.
No.
He has two meet cutes where, like,
Yes.
one is a 7-year relationship. When it begins and when it ends are the key moments. When he meets his first wife, and then it's like
It just jumps forward. They're together.
jumps forward into the cozy moments of like ordinary, everyday, real life that are truly special, not this manufactured production of like, the wedding. And that resonated with me. And I'm not taking anything away from someone who thinks their wedding was really, really an important day in their life.
Yeah.
I think for both my wife and I, we both enjoyed it fine, but it was a hoop to jump through. It was like, yeah, like we already know where we stand. We're excited about the rest of our life together, not this one day together. We're excited about the marriage, not about the wedding.
Sure. Yeah.
And
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
but
Well, and I
but we
think
got to do this thing for everyone else, especially since we were poor grad students. We were like, we need your money and gifts.
please, we need towels and dishes.
Yeah,
We need these things. Yeah, yeah. No, I do love the way you put that. 'Cause I think it's so true because obviously the story is told from Braz's chronological timeline is told out of order, right? So we first meet Anna, his wife, or the woman who ends up becoming his wife, whether his child. We meet her in the first issue. We don't see her face, but she's talking to him in that reassuring way when your spouse or your significant other has to go do something he doesn't want to do, which in this case is he has to go to this big gala celebrating his father, this big celebrated author, right? And he's like, I don't want to do this. It also happens to be his birthday, and he talks to her on the phone and she's like, yeah, I'm sorry, I can't be there. But, she's reassuring. So we see that you're right, a really kind of mundane moment of this is what people who are together do for each other, right? But
right.
we don't see her face, we don't know anything about her, and the next relationship he's in is with the woman Olinda, who he meets, in his 20s, that ultimately breaks up and then leads to meeting Anna later. So yeah, just this idea that the first time we see the person that he's with, that he spends his life with, it is just a small mundane moment. It's a phone call of like, sorry, I can't be there for you on this day, but you can do this.
yeah.
It's a very small thing. I think that happens all the time, every day. It isn't the big momentous day. It isn't.
And again,
right. It isn't some red letter
someone
day.
saying that to him isn't like, oh, this is going to be one of the 10 best moments of his life when he reads this.
Yeah.
It's like, that's the stuff that the really good stuff is the stuff that just happens because of the cocktail of things around it at the time. And
they've had that conversation a dozen times before because of who Braz is and who his father is, right? Because Braz is sitting here wanting to be a writer, but he's writing obituaries. His father is a writer. He's very separate. I'm sure that's a conversation that the two of them have had over and over and over again. So what is special about this one? Really nothing.
Right. Other than when it happens.
Exactly.
And that's just like, I hate to say this, would the birth of Braz's son have been one of these top 10 moments if it hadn't also been when his father passed away? And by the way, that's still, even on the cursory reread, the chills you get when he sees that his mom is already at the hospital, when he's trying to call her. It's such good plotting.
Well, and so that is the only one that I would, in terms of obviously it's a story that's being told and crafted. That's the only one that feels really quote unquote contrived to me, especially when you get to the end, right? Because when you get to that letter that Braz's father writes to him, just kind of the thesis sentence of the entire book, this idea of once you become a parent, basically your life is forfeit. Like your whole being becomes about them, to raise them and teach them to live in a way such that they no longer need you. And it's basically the moment they no longer need you is when they become a parent themselves. And so that is literalized in that issue that, Braz's father writes him that, you're about to become a father. You don't need me anymore. And so literally the moment he becomes a father is when his father leaves him. You know? So yeah, that is kind of the thesis of it there. But I do love the way that issue is plotted and laid out. There is something very beautiful about that. Even though it is very heartbreaking, it is tough to read. I do love that issue. I think the pacing of that, storytelling wise, is kind of perfect.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those, there were two people in the room with me while I was reading, and I was like, I think I have to put this down, just explain to them what happened. But then you're like, just if they ever were to pick up the book, you're robbing them of something,
of that moment.
But I did put down the book. I started to talk, and then I was like, I'm not. I'm just gonna say you should read this, and I'm gonna pick the book back up and keep reading. So have you ever, and I have not, have you ever considered taking the single issues, putting them in chronological order in terms of Braz's life, and reading them in that way?
bananas that you asked that because I had that exact same question.
Oh, right.
Because I went through and I was like, obviously
I mean,
you can lay them
if you're
out.
like a Star Wars fan,
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
all these debates about like, would you watch one, two, three, then four, five, six, or four, five? Do you
yeah,
watch release order or like
yeah,
chronological order? Or, like same with the MCU.
yeah,
Like the Disney Plus app has an option to watch it in chronological order,
yeah. Now
like timeline
I
order,
am.
and I'm like, there's like no one intended this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I believe the story should be consumed in the way that it was released, not the way that the timeline works. Because
Good luck
information
buying
is given,
a
information is
paperback
given in
of
certain.
Narnia. They always put it in numerical order rather than release order.
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
and like
bonkers.
no, it's release order the way that you would have consumed it initially. But real quick going through, so excluding issue 9 because issue 9 is the outlier, it's the dream one. Chronologically the issues go 5, 2, 3, 1, 6, 7, 4, 8, 10. So if you wanted to go that route, but yeah, it's crazy. I had the exact same thing. I don't know. I don't know if it would work. It obviously it only works if you've already read the story because I think
I think I agree with that, but I also think these standalone vignettes all work aside from like the death twist at the end. All of them would work as like solo standalone piece. Like I was thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if they had submitted a short version of one of these to a Vertigo quarterly publication where it's like, here's a 6-page story of an important day in Braz's life and he dies at the end. Like, would that not hook you in to the entire series if you pick that up in a Vertigo quarterly?
yeah, it would. Yeah,
I think
it definitely got me.
and more compellingly than I forget which one has it, but like I love Jeff Lemire, I love Sweet Tooth. There's a little Sweet Tooth story in a Vertigo quarterly, and I was like, well, that was for Sweet Tooth readers. That was not going to sell anyone on Sweet Tooth.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like he goes out and looks at the stars at night and
Yeah,
thinks about the world or something.
that is
and
for
it's
someone
like,
who was familiar with Sweet Tooth and the world and all that. Yeah, yeah.
whereas I think 8 of the 10 issues, I would feel confident giving a floppy to someone who's never read this book before and saying, just dive in, just start reading and see. And I think it is like
I would
a little
assume
bit
I would
of
assume
that.
the two you wouldn't would be number 9, which is Dreams, and then the one where he's a child,
I
or
think
the
the one
last
where he's
one.
a child kind of works. I think the last one, I think it was just be 9 and 10. I wouldn't
Okay, all
do
right. Yeah.
because
Well,
they
yeah,
do feel like they're
10
ramping
does
toward
kind
an
of spoil
end.
the whole 10 does kind of wrap the whole 9 and 10 really are because 9 is kind of the being the penultimate. It does kind of wrap up all the different timelines as we moves through the moments of his own life, and then 10 kind of is the coda. So yeah, that is true. I guess the first 8 are really the ones that use the conceit of him dying at the end. But I haven't thought about that way. The thing that I've thought about almost every time I've read it and reread this is what it would have been like to have read that first issue in single issue when it first came out. Because this is the book I came to in somewhere in 2011, 2012-ish, recommended to me by another comic book podcast, a guy who loved this book, and I knew nothing about it. So I've only read this. I read it soon after it was completed, but I've only ever read it in trade, meaning you sit down and you read the whole thing and you kind of binge through and you get kind of the whatever mind-blowing twist of him dying over and over again. You get the conceit and you're in it. But I think back and like, God, if I had read this December '09 and read that first issue and he dies at the end, and the thought is like, what the hell is this book then? Like, what is this about?
Well, that was my first impression when I had the first issue.
Does he die, and then do we follow someone else in his life? And
Right, yeah, we follow
what
the,
happened?
I don't know.
The father now, or his wife?
The first cop to walk into the
dog?
bar. Yeah, it's
yeah,
like,
yeah. Yeah,
like does it
was
pass the torch?
yeah, yeah. And I was like, I always think like, what would my thought have been if I had read that and been like, what is this book? Like, what happens here? Obviously you lose that when you have the whole collection there and you get into the conceit and the construction of the story,
But
which
I didn't
think is
get that.
beneficial and great.
I mean, I would have to go back and check. But the first time reading it, I thought he actually died that night at age 32 on his birthday. like Shakespeare, he's always dying on his birthday. But then you go to issue 2 and it's him at age 21.
It's
And
a
it's like,
flash.
okay, great. It's like, right. So now we're going to go backwards through his life. But then he dies at the end of the second issue. And then you're like, okay, officially now, what in the hell is going on?
Okay.
And then it's only when you jump to one where he's older than the first issue do you realize, okay, we're doing a thing now.
Yeah. Which and that actually is issue 4 because 2 and 3 essentially are back to back because that's him. 2 is when he's young at 21 in Salvador. That's when he meets Olinda, and then issue 3 is at 28 when that ends, when that relationship ends, and he sees Anna, the woman who would end up being his wife later on. So yeah, those go back to back, but they're both younger than issue 1. And then it isn't until issue 4 when we jump ahead of that, and that is issue 4 is kind of what is that? That is his birth of his son. Yeah. That's when his son is born, his father dies. That's the one where it jumps after issue 1. So yeah, I guess I never thought of it that way. Of he actually dies in issue 1, and the series is going to be flashbacks of the other points of his life, which would still
but that's how you're forced to read it if you don't know the premise coming in.
Yeah. That would still fit with the title of the book, right? Daytripper. The idea of that
Let's talk about the title.
Sure, but you're jumping back to specific moments of days in your life, and that would still make sense if he dies at age 32 on his birthday before this gala for his father, and the rest of the story is flashing back to various days in his life previous, and all those moments that lead up and make him the person that he is when he dies. That title would still hold then, but I guess I never thought of it that way when we jump as I was reading it, although it's hard to remember exactly what I was thinking then the first time I read it. But
I definitely thought he was dead when, like, at the end of the first issue, because again, you don't know what you're
context.
into.
Yeah.
And I think that was what, like going back to our interview with Pornsack, that was what, he was talking about was like, okay, how do you market this book without giving away the whole story, and without admitting, so like I think the balancing act is saying, okay, well, we don't want to give away that he's not really dead and that this is like kind of a fantasy role-playing experiment of what if I had died on this consequential day in my life. What would have been left, what would my legacy be, what would be said about me as someone who professionally is the definitive sayer of what is said about someone after they die, without it being like, oh, it's about the twist. Because the book is not about the twist; it just has the twist in my mind.
Yeah. That's a great point. It's a construct of how they tell the story. But you're right; it's not about him dying every day, quote unquote, in each issue.
Right. And that would be a far less. That's the half-baked version of this story. Where it's just like, he dies, gotcha. And, these aren't gotcha moments. They're just like, oh man, he's just right on the cusp of figuring out.
It is an issue 1. It's a gotcha moment in issue 1. I mean, you have to admit to that.
True.
Because if you don't know it's coming, it ends with him dying. You're like, wait, what? What? But then I think after that, even because, we don't see him die in issue 2. You get the then that he goes out to sea and he drowns, So I do think there is a gotcha moment. I think that's why that first issue maybe is the most violent act.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I meant to say is that it's not merely a gotcha moment. Like it serves a greater purpose.
It does by the time you read the whole story. I'm saying in isolation, that first issue being that violent of an end in that way, that's meant to be a gotcha where you're I think you're supposed to say, like, wait, what is this book?
Love to know what I would have done as a single issue reader in 2010.
Yeah, like, exactly. I have
water cooler talk. It's just like, what would we be saying about it? Would we be saying, like, would we be speculating about, you're like, oh my gosh,
what is this book?
Or like, what is this book? What are they going to do next? It's going to follow someone else. It's going to do this, this, and this. I don't know.
I don't. I can't wrap my head around what I would have thought if I'd only had one issue and then had to wait a month for the next one. This is one of those books that, again, it, it paradoxically, as we mentioned, it benefits from reading it issue by issue and giving
Right.
yourself time to contemplate and think, but it also benefits by having all the issues at one time, whether you read them all or not. It's like it this book is better for knowing that you have the entire story together at the same time reading it in segments.
Yeah.
Like you have to have the foreknowledge that it's complete and there's the whole thing, but reading it in a way that meters it out and kind of slow plays it. Because I think I would have lost my mind and been like, I don't know what this book is. Like there are hooks and there are hooks, and this is the kind of hook where I'd be like, I don't even know what's next. Like this book could go anywhere, and of course it goes in a way that I think is so beautiful and so expansive and kind of so deep that there's no way I could have predicted that if I had just read issue one and that's all I had.
Yeah.
There's no way I could have gone down this route.
Can I tell you what my closest comp is as a comic reader?
Okay.
So I think the discussion that I imagine would have happened around issue one of this, and I actually think the series are very similar in my mind, but it might be a jump for some people, is I remember when Tom King's Mr. Miracle #1 dropped. And the like, oh my God, what is this book?
Yeah.
Like, first of all, I didn't know who Mr. Miracle was because I didn't read like old Jack Kirby stuff.
Sure.
Like
Not a
I
big
took
fourth-world
it
guy.
on faith from Kendall, our comic shop proprietor, that this was an old character, that Tom King was doing a new thing with. But you get that like gritty Mitch artwork.
Yeah.
And this like plucky, I'm an escape artist type character is attempting suicide on the third page. And, it's just like, oh my gosh, the shock, the horror, the awe. And then I would love to talk about that book on this podcast sometime, just because there is still debate about what that book is, what it means. Like, did he actually succeed in a suicide on the third page of the book, and the rest of the book is about some kind of
Just in his
afterlife?
head,
or is that in his head, or is this just part of his like respawn process? And because like the big twist was like, oh, his power basically is he can escape any situation, but he, including death, but he can't escape life, and that was like the big twist. And it was like, I think the issue to issue like philosophical nature, and I remember, I think I linked this in my mind. Is it issue 2 where he's like at the beach and he meets the girl and of this? And then I remember
yes.
philosophical
Daytripper,
conversation on a beach between Mr. Miracle and Barda. And,
Yes, that happens later in the series.
like issue 5 or something. I don't know. So I was like, there are just so many similar beats, similar moments from totally juxtaposed. Like that's, and this slice of life story is more suited to it. I think people who pick up a Vertigo book like this expect that. Some people who reacted negatively, which was a minority to Mr. Miracle, were like,
What is
like,
this?
what is this?
Superhero book.
He's not right. He's not on a mission. He's not punching anyone. He's not working for anyone. There's not really even an opposition. There's just him.
It's very much the Tom King style. It's the existential crisis of superheroes, which is essentially what is slice of life for a superhero.
Right. Which is like, and he owns that. Like, I don't think we need 4 other people trying to do slice of life superhero stories. We've got Tom King literally doing it for all of them if you give him enough time. It's
sad superheroes staring out windows in the rain. That's what he does. But that is an interesting comp that I wouldn't have thought of. But you're right. There's a vibe comp with Daytripper in the idea of like there's some discombobulation for the reader. Like you're like, I don't know what this book is. Like, well, I don't know what it's trying to say. I don't know, even though, you're right. Two completely different genres and kind of approaches, but you're left, I think, with the similar-ish feeling at the end of each issue, where like it's kind of brain melty, and you're like, wait, how does that apply to the previous issue I just read? Like, are these connected? Are they not? Like, how does this all mesh together? And it's only when you get kind of to the end can you kind of start putting all the pieces together.
Right. And I have to say, I have to admit that my reaction to Mr. Miracle #1, not knowing who the character was, not knowing anything about it, I don't even think I was super familiar with Tom King other than he had just started on Batman not that long ago. I had not read his like
Probably would have been
Marvel
all you've
Vision
read. You probably
stuff,
hadn't read Vision. You
and I
probably
hadn't
haven't
read
read Sheriff
Sheriff.
yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At that point, I hadn't. So I was like, I don't really know who this guy is. I don't know who Mr. Miracle is. I don't have any idea what is happening. Like, and I didn't know the New Gods lore. And it's like, he's the son of me, and it's the, dark side is flashing on every page. I was like, I think this is just too confusing, and I'm not interested enough to learn more. I'm out. And like, Kendall couldn't believe it. And also, I didn't pull that book. He added it to my pull pile when I came in, and I was like, "What is this? I've never heard of this. I didn't ask for this." He's like, "It's the best book of the year. You want this issue." And thank you, by the way, Kendall, because not only was he right in the long run, I ended up loving that book, but on trade, like I think I did bail on that one in single issue. I was like, it's just a lot. When you read a lot of comic books monthly, it's a lot to like get back into that space
It's
to,
heavy.
to read
Yeah.
that story. And the same with Daytripper. It's like,
Yeah.
can you imagine your monthly pool? You go in, you're like, okay, I got Batman, I got Spider-Man, I got this, I got issue 4 of Daytripper.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Yeah.
it's just a totally different vibe. It's like,
Well,
you can sit down in the armchair and read your superhero books, go have dinner, come back, and then read the Daytripper issue. Like, that's
and I mean, I didn't read this in single issue, but like the order in which I read my comics is very specific. Like I read all the superhero stuff first. I read my Marvel and DC first, X-Men first, I read all that stuff first, and then I leave like, the stuff written by Jamestown and the Four. Like I got to get in the right headspace to read World Tree. I got to get in the right headspace
right.
to read Something's Killing the Children. I got to when I get to the, those always come at the end because sometimes I feel like I do want to sit with those and take a little more time. Like, oh, I got 3 issues of various X-Men books, Amazing Spider-Man, Batman. I can burn through those. I know what's happening there. So I space out my reading every week very specifically. So if I have a book like Daytripper, and there aren't a lot of books that are as heavy as this, but you're absolutely right in terms of this puts you in it requires a different headspace, and it puts you in a different headspace than reading your monthly superhero kind of comic, And again, not a pejorative. It's not saying one's better than the other. I think the industry needs both, and you and I both consume both. I love both, but it does
this would
require
never exist without those.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. You can't have something like this if these guys, if these guys haven't done other kind of work. And but yeah, there is a heaviness too, and which is why we said if you could read this one issue at a time and sit and think about that moment in Braz's life. What did this moment mean? And it, in a lot of ways, again, it's tough to look at that in isolation. It's like you have to read it almost like you did, read it individually and then binge the whole thing. And then when you get to the end of his life and you get to the end and he's an old man dying of cancer on the beach and he's reading that letter written by his father, then can you kind of go back and look at each one of these moments and kind of decipher like why this was important? Again, because it's not important because he dies at the end of each one, but it's kind of finding why these points were isolated. What was important about this moment? Issue 2, what was important? It wasn't meeting this woman, Olinda, so he could be in this relationship for a while and have his heart broken so he could then meet his wife? Or was it important because he got to spend that moment with his best friend, Jorge? Which I'm assuming it's Jorge, but the Brazilian and his Portuguese and the J's are actually J's there. So maybe it could be George.
I don't know. Yeah, I was gonna say I don't know Portuguese. I was reading this last night with a friend of mine who spent the last 5 years living in Guatemala. Is fluent in Spanish, and I said I realized this would be Portuguese. I said, but can you make sure that I'm pronouncing Braz's name correctly?
Yeah.
And she looked at it and she said, basically like it was one word, Bras de Olivia Domingos. Bras de Olivia Domingos. Like it's
Yeah.
like one word, and I was like, okay, so I should just say it really fast in
I'm I'm
context.
I'm I'm
I
I'm,
was
I'm
like,
going. It's bras. That's it. His
yeah,
bras.
no,
That's
no,
it.
no. That's
Yeah.
100% correct.
Yeah.
What
Anything else
you
after that? Yeah.
what you cannot allow for an American is for it to say bras. That's
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
really the only thing to avoid here. I think anything else is fair game.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm not saying his full name every time I talk about him because there's not so many. That's the other thing I love about a good slice of life story is a very small cast of characters.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I was gonna that was one of the 2 points I was gonna make when comparing this back a couple weeks ago to when we talked about the many deaths of Layla Starr. In terms
Oh
of
yeah,
we talked
right.
about how that book has a similar vibe, and I felt it could to Daytripper. As I mentioned, Daytripper is this book that for almost the past 15 years for me, coming up on 15 years, close to it, that I've been recommending that book to people who are just like, I don't read comics. What should I read? Read this book, try it. It's evergreen. Even though, some of the way people are drawn and the flip phones, maybe it's dated to again, kind of the
Oh,
the
but I actually
the
thought
the
that's what
author what
was brilliant about the flip
well,
phone scene is
well
that it's all set backwards.
yes, yeah, yeah. So, but there is still an evergreen quality to this book. And I think Layla Starr can be something similar. And the two things they have in common, one, small cast of characters. You're following these, don't only, here, maybe a half dozen total, Layla Starr, even less. You're following this small group of characters as they progress through life, through someone's life, throughout the story. Other thing I love about it is that they're so specific to a place and a culture that you don't have to know anything about that place and culture. They bring it into you. They don't hold your hand. There's no big explanation as to what's going on here. You just know this is that Layla Starr is set in India. It's a very Indian story. The things that are in the background, I'm sure there's so much flavor there in terms of like what's drawn, how the city looks, the way the food looks, the clothes, everything about it. You can just tell it's very, whether you know what the specificity is, it's there. And that just adds to the experience. You can lose yourself and understand that this is a different culture, a different world. And you, as long as you accept that, you're in with the story. I think Daytripper has that exact same feel. This is a book that, in a lot of ways, is like inherently Brazilian because that's where Moon and Ba are from. It's where it's where they grew up. It's where they live. But you don't have to know anything about that.
Well, let me just say though, the thing about that is when I had that 5 year gap from having read it the first time and revisiting it, if you asked me where it was set, I think I would have just said America by default. The fact that like our cities, our lives, the slice of life concerns of people are basically the same everywhere. And the fact that it wasn't an American depicting Brazil, which would have like the Hollywood yellow wash over it or whatever,
Yeah,
it's
definitely
like
be filtered. Yeah.
right. There was no filter on it. It was just like, here's a guy who loves a cup of coffee at the corner cafe downtown, and he's got a dog at home, and it's like, he'll kick back and watch TV, and he wants to be a writer. It's like, yeah, that's like every character from like major network shows for the last 30 years. It's just change, where he is to New York City or LA.
Well,
So I think like what you're saying, you don't need to know that much about Brazil. What you need to know is people. You need to understand yourself. You need to understand other people and understand that like we all have the same basic ingredients to life, regardless of
100%,
setting.
100%. That's where I was getting. There's a specificity to this story that again reaches this universality of it. I think the same thing happens in Layla Starr in that it's very specific to their culture and kind of the Hindu idea of life and death and who their gods are and things of that nature. But the idea when you're following that character of Darius through, he's just living life and he has the experiences that anyone can have as a child, as an adolescent, as an adult, as a spouse, as a parent, all of that. He has these, there's a universality to that experience of life. Same thing here with Braz. And yet there is so much specificity in the story in terms of the location, the idea, the culture of Brazil here that is infused in the story. And yet anyone can connect to it because you're right. It is about just the characters. It's about this person trying to live their life. It doesn't matter where or when it is. Those things are touch points. So, but that's what I love about both these stories, that they can infuse the creators can infuse their culture, the people that they are, into their story, and have it still resonate across any audience, you know,
Right.
because
Well, and that's the other thing.
because
Yeah.
they've tapped into something greater. And
And
so by being hyper specific and setting it in a time and a place about a kind of person, it can reach this larger audience that anyone can read and anyone connect with. And I think that's what makes a book, for me, what's make Daytripper special. And that I'm not just handing it to someone like, oh, you're from Brazil, you've been there, read this book. No, 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 no. I don't care what your life experience is. You're going to connect with this book. I'm going to hand this to you. And one of these issues, one of them is going to hit you in some way. Some point that they've depicted in Braz's life, one of these is going to land with you. Maybe a little harder than the other ones. And that's what's going to hook you in. And it doesn't matter where it's set, when it's set, anything like that.
Right. And I
That
think
universal
that's
experience of life is gonna connect.
right. And I think that is like the beauty of like non-contrived representation.
Yeah.
It's like we have Brazilian, artists telling a Brazilian story,
Yeah.
and I think if an American writer, no matter how well intentioned, set a story in Brazil or India, they would spend so much time trying to explain the stuff. Like they have to prove how much they learned about the culture.
That's what
and they're
yes,
going to explain it all. And it's
Yeah.
like I really, really, really appreciate where that's coming from.
Yeah.
And it's
Oh, it's
so
always
bad
good
to
intentioned. It's
Right.
always good intentioned.
Yeah, but
Almost always
it's-
good intentioned.
Right, almost always good intention,
But you're
and
right,
almost
terrible
always
read.
clunky to read because it's
Terrible
just
read,
like
yeah.
a cultural information dump.
Yeah.
But as someone writing from the outside, you don't know how much you have to explain because you're like, well, this is how much I had to learn in order to try to tell this story,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's just something that writing in your own culture doesn't require.
It's intrinsic to them. They just know, Moon and Ba have another incredible book. It's called Two Brothers. It's a graphic novel adaptation of, I believe, an award-winning Brazilian novel. So an incredibly famous book in Brazil that happens to be about the life of two twin brothers. So maybe a little hat on the hat for Moon and Ba to do,
Right.
being twins themselves. But it again, that is a celebrated Brazilian novel that they've adapted as two Brazilian artists into comic form, like none more Brazil. And it's still a beautiful, incredible story because I think that book, the reason it's so celebrated is that it does have this wider, greater appeal, and that kind of it fits so well into what Moon and Ba do as storytellers together. So if you enjoy Daytripper and just kind of their arts, their creative work together, their output together, because again, in terms of who draws, who writes, that doesn't really say. I do believe all the colors though are Gabriel Ba. I think he specifically did all the covers, but in terms of the interior work, who wrote what, who drew what, it seems pretty muddled. I think they kind of work in tandem. Maybe they just trade pages back and forth. I have no idea. But
Yeah,
pick
which
up
by the
Two
way,
Brothers.
I don't think we've called out today. Well, I know we did in the zero that Dave Stewart was the colorist here.
Oh yeah,
which is
Dave
one
Stewart.
of those like
Again,
put a blindfold on it and guess who the colorist is. It's
literally
like
the
Dave
greatest
Stewart.
colorist of all time.
Right.
The greatest
It's
colorist
like
of all time.
high probability you're going to have Dave Stewart. And then we want to call out Sean for lettering because both
Yeah.
Moon and Ba also do lettering for other people or their other projects.
And they've done their own books as well too. Yeah, and
right.
I think Two Brothers maybe was all of them.
So
but
for them to introduce a foreign letterer, I like this is such an intimate book.
Yeah.
Written but two familial brothers who live down the road from each other, written, drawn, like you don't even know who drew, who wrote what. By the time it's coming to the colorist and the letterer, I would imagine it takes a great level of empathy and understanding the story and the objective, like an intuition that just a rookie couldn't have, and a Dave Stewart is able to pick up because the coloring, and they both colored things too, right?
They do, yeah. I mean, again, look at the covers that that Gabriel Ba does. And but you get that same color palette sense in what's going
Right.
on in the pages. There's kind of a warmthness to the reds, orange, and yellows, and yet when it needs to be kind of cool and cold with the blues and all and the shadows. Like again, Dave Stewart is literally the greatest colorist in comics. Like the Eisner Award for best colorist, like he should never be up for that anymore. Like he should have an emeritus position. It should be named after him. It should be the Dave Stewart Eisner for best colorist. Like that's just how it should be. So the fact and I have to imagine part of that is working at Vertigo and you bring in, this is kind of the editorial staff, bringing people in, maybe helping with deadlines, making sure books come out in time and things of that nature. But there is still, if you read other work that Moon and Ba have done, either together or separately, there's kind of a homogeneity in the way it's colored, the way that Stewart approached coloring their work that I think is indicative of the stuff that they do on their own. So it is at the highest level, but it feels of a piece with the other stuff that I've read from both Moon and Ba, again, working together and or separately.
Yeah. Amazingly, I mean, I'm almost out of things to say about this book, but at the same time, could talk about it all day. Like if we went page by page, I could go page by page. This is one of those books. But I've exhausted my full list of big notes here. Other than I made a note as we were talking, it seems like you maybe bumped a little bit on chapter 5, which is
Yeah, the
when he's
childhood
a
one.
kid.
Yeah. Yeah. And I only say that because it's the only story from that part of his life. It jumps from age 11 to age 21. And then the bulk of the story is 21 to 47, basically his from a young adult, I guess, into being an actual adult. So it just felt strange in terms of isolation, that this is one story as a child. And part of it is repeating this story of his own birth, the little miracle his mother calls her. He was born during a blackout. But the fact that there wasn't a story of him at like 16 or something, like in high school. I feel like the age 11 story would have been bolstered if there was one story of him at kind of that age, that kind of awkward mid-teenager kind of stage. And then you jump to 21 when he goes to Salvador and all that, and kind of his life as he kind of sees it begins. That's the only reason I bump on that, is because it feels like it's such an isolated story. It feels less connected to the rest of what's being shown about his life.
Right. I think to me, it's less about the year gap and more about the incidents. Like this whole issue to me is about that kiss underneath the tree.
Yeah,
Like
sure.
that was his first quiet space with a girl he kind of had a crush on. And it was the first time. So like you could do the teenage one where he gets his first girlfriend or whatever, but that first kiss was already like, that was his high watermark. That was the big day. And so then if you start going through his life, it's like, damn, basically all of his most important moments are about like love and family and needing to express himself that way.
It's connections who are losing
this,
loved ones. Yeah.
right. And so it's, the first kiss with this girl, first time he meets first girlfriend, the loss of that girlfriend, first time he meets who will become his wife, the birth of his son, the loss of his father. It's like, it's like all of his life. And like, he talks so much. And here's the other thing that's missing. He so badly wants to be a writer. He finally writes a book. The completion of that book, not one of the chapters.
Yeah. Yeah.
So no matter how important, in every single issue, he talks about how central it is to his identity to become a writer. He really wants to become a writer, yada, 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 yada. He becomes a writer, and it's not, it's just not that big of a deal. In the grand scheme of things in his life, it's about these relationships and his friendship.
What happened?
His friendship is the other one, and that's the only one that's non-romantic, non-family. But that's like the found family.
But yeah, it's still it's someone that he loves in his life. Whether it's his family, whether his friend, all of that there. Yeah, I that is a great point about the book too, because you look about what happens around that portion of his life. So I went through again. I mentioned I put the issues in chronological order here in my notes here. So issue 1 starts off at age 32 when I think he's at like the lowest point of his life, like career wise. Like he actually like he doesn't like what he's doing. He's with the woman we know will be his wife, but he's struggling with who he is in the shadow of his father. That's issue one. The next chronological issue is issue six, just a year later, 33. That's the plane crash issue when he has to go and write the obituaries for all these people who died in this plane accident. And that becomes like the high watermark of his obituary writing career. And that then leads the next time we see him is what issue 38. That's when he tracks down his friend, Jorge or George, whatever. But at that point, he's already a published author. So it's like,
Right. Now, here's the question I have.
On
a story like that, where does the fantasy begin? Like he finds his friend, and that's where the actual story ended.
I think for the most part, all these issues that you talked about how that if you lop up like the last 2 pages, I think that's where it diverges. That the story goes through, and
so he really found his friend like out in the desert in this thing, but instead of his friend trying to kill him,
maybe he was already
a more
dead.
mundane ending. Yeah,
maybe he was already dead. Yeah. Because you get these great things when you read this book over and over again. Like there is a something earlier where his wife Anna mentions or they're Braz and Anna are talking about like how they wish Jorge were here or something like that, and you don't know why he's missing. You don't know why he's gone. And then as you read through, you realize, oh, it's because he could have been on this plane crash and he wasn't. And then he bails on basically society and life. And then you see what happens when Braz goes and tries to track him down. So you get the gaps filled in of why he's no longer in Braz's life. When we first meet him, these guys are, they're best friends. They're best friends at the paper because, Jorge's a photographer. They were best friends as kids because they went on this trip to El Salvador together. So all these things. And so the way that Moon and Ba are able just to weave these story elements in together, the different parts of Braz's life and the way that they deploy the information on a reread, you can, when you know what the ultimate story is, you get all these great little kind of Easter eggs and just kind of clever moments where you see how much they seeded in terms of what they told the reader about Braz's life, what and when was important. Meaning, there's intention to how they cut the story up and what they told when, and that there's just I can marvel at the storytelling process, right? The mechanics of storytelling.
Right.
And, anytime you tell a story out of chronological order, there's always the worry of how clever are the storytellers? Are they being too clever in terms of how they dole out information? I think with this book, there's a level of near perfection in terms of how much you get about Braz's life when you get it, and kind of the state of the reader, because in terms of how much information you already have, how that information affects you as the reader based on what you know about Braz's life. I think there's something near perfection about that with this.
Yeah, the architecture of the book is flawless. Yeah. And I was talking to, oh boy, who was it? It was Aaron Campbell who did the art for Infidel. By
with Pornsack. Yep.
And I said, what was it like working with Pornsack? He was like, he was the most meticulous, like storyboarder, storyteller, everything. All the math has to math in terms of the beats and everything else. And knowing that he was involved in the editing of this book.
Well, just as an editor in general. I mean, he was
as an editor in general, but like in this book, like I don't know how much of that was like little nudges from Pornsack to be like, if you just place this here and this there and this, like just move this piece there, but like, Pornsack being a very nice, humble guy, I think when we were talking to him, he kind of downplayed or minimized his role in this book because he was like, it's Moon and Ba, like that's just a very particular dynamic. But it feels to me like I can see his fingerprints on, just the plotting, the arrangement of story. Not, he's not telling them what story to tell. He's just helping them make it shine the way they want it to. Putting a nice.
I'm sure. Yeah, there's a level of I don't want to say interference, but involvement with editorial staff, especially someone like this, especially when you have a book again that is told out of order. you want to make sure that someone is keeping track of all the details. And so, yeah, I'm sure that they had a Moon and Ba in their own mind. They had some sort of timeline and, just making sure that everyone's on the same page and that we're going to tell this part now, and then we're going to tell the next part much, much later. And we're going to tell the part in front of that at the very end, and making sure all those, because it's not just a matter of cutting up your timeline, right? When you're telling stories like this, it, it matters how you tell those pieces and what you tell to make the pieces mesh in the end. You
Yes.
can't just you can't just cut up the story and put B before A and then D before B, but put E at the end. But A is you can't just cut up randomly. You have to make sure it does mesh and come together so that when you're told something out of order, it's able to resonate when you get back to it at the end. When you get the resolution, it has to still stick in your mind. And so,
Right.
yeah, I
And
think
the order has to mean something.
yes,
Which I
yeah,
think
it
is
has to
why
be
a lot
important.
of people started questioning whether they should tell stories chronologically. However, I will say, and I know I've complained about this before, I find it very irritating when it feels like people are just slicing and dicing the timeline, either to like stretch the B plot out
Yeah,
or just because the story wouldn't be interesting chronologically. And I'm like, well, if it's not interesting chronologically, you can't gain, you can't
yeah,
make
yeah.
a story more compelling by scrambling the order. It has to be an interesting story, and then you're adding an additional twist by scrambling the order.
Well, I
And
mean,
as much as I am sensitive to like timeline jumps, especially in TV shows, like TV shows, it's always to pad the runtime.
I was just going to say, like, it's a generally a very lazy thing to do for episode of television, and I get it when you're making television a whole bunch there. But when you start the show, your cold open is in media res, and there's some big cliffhanger, and then it's like 18 hours earlier. And it's like, oh, damn it, come on,
Yeah.
like if you have to tease the end so you can get to the beginning, then what are the odds that the story you're going to tell is going to be as good? Sometimes it is. I'm not
Right.
saying you
There are
can't do that.
exceptions. The
Yeah, I'm not saying you
exceptions,
can't do
but
that.
the fact that like
every time
as
it
you're
happens,
saying that,
yes,
I'm like, well, here's one exception, and it's like end of season 1 of The West Wing. It's like, what kind of day has it been? It's like, does the 18-hour earlier time jump, and they do it well. But the fact, like, this is the literal exception proves the rule.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
the fact that when it's done well, we can make note of it, and the fact that we see it all the time, and it's usually not done well, and it's usually meaningless.
It's
And there
it, it
are like some of my favorite writers, I think, are overly reliant on this trope.
yeah,
And I'm
yeah,
not
yeah.
going to call anybody out because that's not what we do here. But
But the idea that we're creating suspense by I'm going to give you a tease, and then and it's artificial though because you're going to get it explained here. Now, obviously, this book doesn't have that, but again, the idea of as you're reading the initial issues, you're being introduced to ideas and characters that don't make any sense yet because you haven't been told what the backstory is. And again, to get to the end and have everything meshed together, I think that I think is where this book is really really shines in terms of like again you're right, the architecture, the mechanics of the story, how they deliver, independent of what they're delivering as a story, simply how they deliver the story to you, I think is incredible. And then the fact that the story you get is what Daytripper is, this incredibly kind of poignant and deep and heartfelt, very personal story about Braz's journey and what it means to live a life and what you do with your life. That the story you get is so good and so elevated. And then the next thing higher is how it's done. I love Moon and Ba's artwork. I love the way that this draws. Like we talked about at the top of this episode, this kind of there's a surreality to it, that it is real life, but there's something about the way that they draw their lines and the way in this case that Dave Stewart has colored it, that there is this dreaminess quality to it, that you're not quite certain what is real, what is not. I think that's all intentional. I love that. I think it's so beautiful on the page, which is why I'm so drawn to Moon and Ba as creators. So just like on every level, for me, this comic just hits, which is why it is quite literally, depending on the day you talk to me, it could be the fifth or sixth favorite comic of all time. Like
I find it
actual
hard to believe
hard number.
Yeah, like it's easy top 10.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I think
my
anything.
top four are fixed. Like those can never change at this point, pretty much. So
Well, and
like,
I was gonna say, like, I think there might be one or two for me that are above this, but only because of when I read those.
of course,
Like,
yeah, yeah,
they have to do with the subjectivity of like how they formed me as a comic reader and when they hit me in
of
life,
course, of course.
rather than being objectively better. Like, I don't know if there are five objectively better like 10 issue series than
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
And I also have like separate lists for like, well, I have my favorite 6 issue series, my favorite 12 issue series, my favorite like, under 100 but ongoing series. My favorite series called Saga, that's its own category in every way. It's just like, yeah, I'm bad at these lists, and so I make so many of them that they're all meaningless. Which is yep, part of the problem, but also stop trying to make me list things, even though I'm
Yeah.
frequently the one doing it to myself.
Yeah, we're always listing things. So
Um,
I guess I don't have a whole lot of notes. I don't know if you have any either. I guess in the end here, the last thing I really have is like how this plays into our overall theme, this idea of Death Month and how we look at this story kind of in comparison to some of the books we just talked about. Like, last week was I Kill Giants. Man, it's Little Star before that. And then even kind of Swan Songs, the anthology we kicked the whole thing off with a few weeks back. Just this idea of death and dying and what this book has to say about it. I wrote down part of what the final pages of this book kind of give the reader, which are the message that Brass's father gives to him, kind of that he only reads at the end of his life. This idea that, you know, the idea of your child, the, you can let go when your child no longer needs you. This idea that you're raising your child to surpass you, and that is when you can let go. That's when you can die, and what's being shown kind of over and over again in this story, I think, is the idea of what does it mean to live your life, to how you live your life. What does it mean for, these days that again seem mundane but end up being important? And if this is what the important moments of your life are, what does it mean to live then? What does it mean to exist in these seemingly mundane moments? How do you use that to do the thing you are meant to do, you want to do, you're supposed to do, whatever it is, to live the life that you
Figure
think
out
you're
who you
supposed to
are.
live?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
yeah. So I thought the thesis statements. I actually didn't have my notebook or pen with me, but I just kept taking pictures of key quotes
Okay.
when I was thinking of the theme.
Yeah.
And thankfully, these pages are enumerated. But on page 22, he's talking to Jorge, and you don't need to look it up. You will remember.
Oh,
And he's kind of being mopey, Braz is, and he says, I want to write about life, Jorge, and now look at
yeah.
me. All I write about is death. And Jorge's like, ding, ding, ding. I think you've like two sides of the same coin. And then the thesis statement for the book, when he's having drinks with his father, and his father says, life is made of these moments, son. Relationships are based on such moments, such choices, such actions. And that's the one moment I will carry with me after all others, the one which makes all others worthwhile. You should look for such moments in life, moments you'll never forget. And of course, the moment he's never forgetting at the time is, I hate you, you piece of,
Yeah.
or family friendly rating. So I won't finish the quote, but I think you could probably gather what it is. But then when he's talking to who, on my quick reread this morning, I was like, this is correctly labeling her as like the bastard child of his father.
Yeah,
Yeah,
his half sister. Yeah.
right. She's saying death gives us a whole new perspective on living and everything else seems so minor, silly. They're standing in front of a vending machine,
Yeah.
in a hospital, and the definition here of every he says, books were Benedito's greatest passion, and if Braz could be a part of that world, he could assure his place in his father's heart. And so you
Yeah.
learn all of his writing and everything else was really just about cementing the place in his father's heart, the place
Yeah.
that his son instantly gets from him, just the moment
Yeah.
he's born, just by merits of existing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well,
and when he
it's what.
sees that his father is actively reading his book, his heart literally stops. And
Yeah.
it's like I could die in this moment,
Yeah.
because I learned that I was there. I
Yeah.
reached what I wanted. I was in, my father's heart at the deepest level. So anyway, those were the moments for me that really like just jumped out and slapped me as like, this is your Death Month theme. This is your
Yeah.
like who could read these four books back to back and not see all the connective tissue, even though, none of this is by intention.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, I think something we mentioned, I think probably back in the zero, uh, several weeks back, the idea that every story, and it's the theme about all of these books. The one thing that's true, and not just about the four books we talked about, but anything that deals with the idea of death, confronting death and dying, every story about death is a story about life. Because the idea that it is coming to the understanding that everything dies, everything ends. And if everything ends, what matters is the living. What matters is how you get to that end. The question comes in maybe, again, how long you have, how long does something exist? Sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's shorter. It's not fair often what that
Right.
determination is, but what matters is what you do in that time, what in the time that you are given, right? And so how you approach life and how it's presented to you, and in this in case in Daytripper here is what do you find important in the end? How you live your life, what are the important moments, what are the things that are going to stand out to you when you look back, and the idea that it could be some of the more mundane moments. It's a glance here, it's seeing someone across an aisle at a store or something. It's a sit down with your father. Yes, maybe it's the day that your child is born. you know it's a day of tragedy, having to deal like with this plane crash or something like that. It is the moments that are important are kind of, again, they're all around, and you don't necessarily know what they are when they happen, which could then imply that you should celebrate all the moments. If you don't know which ones are going to be good, if you don't know which ones are going to matter, then maybe they all do.
Well, but and then you start to get into the like, well, if everything's special, nothing's special
Yeah, yeah,
type thing. But there's I'm borrowing heavily from someone. I did not come up with this exchange, and it was about a different topic. But I think the cynic would look at what you just said and say, well, then if everything's special, then nothing is special. And someone else, a third party, could walk in and say, well, if everything is special, then everything is
it's
special.
special.
Like,
Yes.
yeah, like you can take, like, it can be said very meaninglessly by the blind optimist, or someone who's just toxic
Or the blind
positivity,
singing. Yeah.
or the blind cynic. And cynicism, in my experience, is more often blind than the optimist. Like, most optimists actually have a pretty gritty backstory, that I met. The ones that you dismiss early in life, maybe not. But like, if you're 40 and you're an optimist, you've seen some stuff. Like, there's
You've been
just no
through it. Yeah.
way you have
And
not
you're
lived through
choosing.
Right.
And you're choosing.
Right. It's a
Yeah.
deliberate path. And, and that's like one of my optimist role models is Barack Obama, just because he's seen some stuff. And he chooses to take a certain outlook, to move forward as if we're not in the worst of all possible worlds, worst of all
Yeah.
possible scenarios.
Yeah.
Despite all of the people encouraging you to take that view. And if you ever read his book, which part 2 should be coming out any decade now,
I'm sure very, very soon, just like Winds of Winter. George
it'll
R. R.
be
Martin.
it'll be 700 pages, and it'll cover an additional 6 months of his presidency. Like, I think he found out there's no term limit on writing, and that's a real problem for all of us. But anyway, yeah, this is a fantastic book. I cannot thank you enough for recommending this to me initially,
Sure, of
and
course.
for agreeing to talk about it, because I also know that, like, we talk about books we like exclusively, but to talk about a book that's so personal, so meaningful, is another level of like personal disclosure for a podcast. If we ever talk about Sandman, I think you might be spent. Then again, that would be stretched out over so many episodes.
Yeah, it'd be a lot tougher now. But yes, it is. This is a book. Again, that it is. When I say it is the again, I don't like to speak in hyperbole. So when I say it is the fifth or sixth favorite comic of all time, like I mean that literally. Like I can list the 4 comics above it and the other comics that are around this one. Like I love this book so much, and again, it is one that I will never stop recommending to somebody, to anybody. In a comic shop, not in a comic shop, in a bookstore, if they're this is a book that again I think everyone will connect to one of the stories. One of the moments in Braz's life will be something that connects with you and that will draw you in. And it'll draw you in to the end. And when you get to the end, I think you see just kind of that deep meaning and thought that goes into the story and presentation. And there's no way it doesn't land with you unless you're maybe like, perhaps if you're already like, if you have no soul, maybe if you're already lost, I guess.
If you're already dead.
Yeah. Even then, but this is a book that I'm so glad we finally got to talk to. Again, it's one that you and I have talked about offline, about maybe doing on the show.
And like I said, the discussion was less scary than I thought it would be, because I think for literally years now, you and I on this podcast have said, it'd be great to do Daytripper, but how do you even enter into that discussion? Like, it's just, you're wading into such deep water instantly as soon as you crack the spine.
Yeah. But I do think having kind of the soft launch of this theme and talking about the idea of loss and losing and dying and death and all of this, I think we've been in the headspace in terms of how to approach a story like this. Because again, you're right. In this case, you're right. It's not about the twist. It's not about the fact that he dies, again, quote unquote, dies at the end of each issue. It's not what the book's about. It's the gimmick of the book, Right. It's about hook. Yeah. It's about everything else about that. That's just the construct that they settled on to give you kind of a frame for how each issue is going to go. But the story isn't about that. It's not about him dying or how he dies or why he dies, because none of that's important, because he doesn't actually die as far as the way you look at the story. He doesn't actually die. He makes it to 76 or whatever at the end of issue 10. So the dying aspect of it is in there, right? It is just the hook. And it's about so much more than that. And kind of all the things, all the layers that Moon and Ba get into about living your life and deciding how you want to live your life, and the kind of life you want to live, and knowing that these moments are out there that at any point can be the moment that allows you to go towards the person you want to be, the life you want to live. I think it's an extraordinary book.
Yeah, very cool book. I don't know how we're going to follow up this Death Month, other than to say, I think theme months will be a thing going forward. Not every month, but but this is so far superior to like lump,
just doing a one shot.
Yeah, right. To doing a one shot, and there are great one shots that we've done,
and we'll still do more.
Wouldn't take them back.
We'll do more too.
And I love creator themed months, but sometimes when you're vamping on one creator over and over again, it's just a lot of different ways to say the same thing.
Sure.
And instead, I want to put 4 different creative teams on the same topic, and see how they it's just new vistas opening.
Just seeing the connective tissue from different books, from different eras, different creators, and just seeing how they all play on the same theme, the same idea, touch on the same topics. I think there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of interesting stuff there, and I think there's more connective tissue in a lot of these different books, different themes, different creators than maybe we would think about. So yeah, definitely. I think there's something we will continue to do. It won't be every month. I think, next month we're still figuring out, but I think it'll jump back into a series and we'll dive in like we have normally, one series, multiple books. But theme months, whether they're a topic, whether they're a creative team, whatever it is, I think it's something going forward we'll definitely explore more of.
Absolutely. All right.
Yep.
Thank you for listening. I hope you feel we've done justice to this fantastic book. If not, I hope you like the book anyway. And, If you did like this discussion, please, share this book with a friend. That's the most important thing. But also mention the podcast. Say, hey, if you like this book and you like talking about death, we got a whole month of it. Weird pitch, but it could work. Anyway, thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.
Peace.